Welcome to the UP Notable Books Club, brought to you by the Upper Peninsula Publisher and Authors Association. Raymond Luczak is perhaps best known for his books, films, and plays. He was raised in Ironwood, a small mining town in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Number 7 in a family of 9 children, he lost much of his hearing due to double pneumonia at the age of 8 months. After high school graduation, Luczak went on to Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., where he earned a BA in English. He learned American Sign Language and became involved with the deaf community and won numerous scholarships in recognition of his writing. In 1988, he moved to New York City. In short order, his play Snooty won first place in the New York Deaf Theater's 1990 Samuel Edwards Deaf Playwrights Competition, and his essay, Notes of a Deaf Gay Writer, won acceptance as a cover story for Christopher Street magazine. Soon after, Allison Publications asked him to edit Eyes of Desire, a deaf, gay, and lesbian reader, which, after its appearance in June 1993, eventually nabbed 2 Lambda Literary Award finalist nominations. In 2005, he relocated to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he continues to write, edit, and publish.
Well, hello, everybody. This is Evelyn Gathu coming from Crystal Falls, next to my mother and next to Julie Niskern. It is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Raymond Luczak, along with Adam, his interpreter. And we're going to have a special time tonight. We're going to be doing some different things. At one point this evening, we're going to ask everyone to turn off their video and make sure you're muted, because that way Adam has an easier time translating for Raymond. Okay. Now, so I've got a few things to talk about, some news. So tonight we're talking about Once Upon a Twin, and Raymond has many poetry books. A new one is called Chlorophyll, all about poems of the Upper Peninsula. So if you liked Once Upon a Twin, you'll like this one. I'm halfway through. And a little bit of business. Next month, we are making a change to the schedule. Instead of reading The Home Wind by Terry Martin, we are going to be reading this book. It's called Great Lakes Monsters and Mysteries.
Ooh.
These 2 guys have been very hard to get a hold of. Right, Victor?
Oh my God. I can't describe how hard it is.
And we managed. So Terry has a conflict, and she couldn't meet in October during her scheduled time. So she's going to be in February. We're going to put these guys in October, and I'll put that all in the email tomorrow. Without any further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Victor for a moment. Victor usually has some news to share.
I do.
Go, Victor.
All right. This is the perfect time of the year to talk about UP Reader. This is our annual publication of the Upper Peninsula Publishers and Authors Association. And you can submit your work to UP Reader and be published. All you have to do is join our group, which is $40 a year for one person, or $50 and your whole family can join. And you have until November 15th to prepare your work and send it in, and you could be in volume 7, which is coming out in April of 2023. So that's really exciting. And I have one other thing to share before I turn it back to Evelyn. All right. This is Compassion, Michigan, and we're going to do something we have never done before in the history of 19 meetings of the UP Notable Book Club. Modern History Press is going to be donating 15 copies of this book to all the libraries in the UP. So I'll be sending this book out to the library co-op in Marquette, and they will distribute 15 copies amongst the 45 UP libraries. So you'll be able to read Raymond's Compassion, Michigan at your local public library. How cool is that? And it's based around almost 60 or 70 years of history in Ironwood, Michigan. And it's got a little bit of an LGBTQ kind of vibe to it, which is something you don't see often in UP literature. So that is all for me, and I will turn it back to Evelyn.
Welcome, everyone. And without any further ado, here comes Raymond. So thank you, Raymond, and thank you, Adam.
I'm delighted you've all come, and it's an honor to be here. I know the Upper Peninsula, and not a lot of people know the UP. And when I go to other cities outside of the UP for readings, people are less familiar. And so I refer to the Upper Peninsula as not the place that they're familiar with, but this place. And so, when I like to write about this specific area that people don't know as much about. So before getting into the book, I do want to share a video that is on YouTube that I think sets up the milieu for the book very nicely, if I may say so. So Victor, if you wouldn't mind, would you go ahead and share the YouTube video?
All right, here we go.
And the book is called Once Upon a Twin. And the book is about the experience of being deaf and oral in the 1970s. And here we go. Here's the video.
9 months. Raymond Luczak. Mom still wonders how I lost my hearing. She mentions having a miscarriage in April '65 and being surprised to find herself pregnant again in June '65. Dr. Santini felt I'd be born in January '66. Instead, I arrived in November '65, fully formed, not a preemie. I go home 2 days later. Not long after, my sister Carol takes to reading out loud from a book. She is learning how to read to me. As I'm trapped in my crib, I have apparently cocked my ears to her voice laboriously decoding words. Then Mom changes her story. She remembers having a miscarriage in March '65. It fell out of her while she sat on the toilet. At age 16, I constantly wondered if that was indeed possible. A body expelling her own fetus like that. A heat wave in July '66. I turned pink and hot, but everyone is hot anyway. Mom wonders maybe something's truly wrong. At the hospital, I'm found to have double pneumonia and a high fever. I looked close to dying, so a priest is called in. I survived my last rites of death, but my hearing doesn't. Then Mom changes details again. She says she had a DNC done in February '65, when she felt her fetus wasn't growing. It wasn't even 2 centimeters long. No idea whether it was a boy or a girl. I'm no longer sure what to believe. After I come back home from the hospital, Carol reads to me again. This time, I bob my head around. She doesn't realize that I've lost most of my hearing. No one has either. She gets frustrated with me and gives up. By the time I turn 2.5, Mom asks her doctor why I haven't begun talking. He says, well, maybe he's deaf. She comes home and tells Dad, who's been washing me. He stands me up and turns me around so I can face the wall above the tub. I don't respond to my name. Research indicates a twin in the womb could miscarry, leaving behind its other half overlooked. In the 60s, technology hadn't existed to detect such a tiny baby. That's why Mom's pregnancy test results in June '65 had so surprised everyone. Up and down Oak Street, where I once roamed, the trees are mostly gone, but the shadow of my other half still runs a mean yellow stripe right through the road of my life. The mystery of never knowing him.
So Evelyn and I were talking about this. Do you have any questions for me, Evelyn, before we move forward about this? Evelyn, do you have any comments or questions before I move on to anything else?
No, but I really, that was a neat video. we enjoyed the twin. Yeah. Is there anything, it's such a confusing thing. Is there anything more that you can add about this beginning, the concept of your book, the twin, to you?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to explain a little bit about that before I go into the poems. So you're all familiar with the UP, and not that many people live there, and there are very, very few deaf people there. And where I was raised, I think there's maybe 4 or 5 deaf people that lived in my hometown at all. And my parents back then were under the belief that speech was the way to go and that you should not include sign language at all. And so the few deaf people that they'd heard about in the area, my parents were not keen on having me meet or interact with them. And so I had no deaf role models. And what role models I had were cast as very negatively. So back then, I don't think people understood the wider place of deaf people in the world. And so I was born to a hearing family of 9 children. So I'm number 7 of 9. So when I was born, I seemed hearing at first, as you saw in the video, and then there came a time when the family realized that I was deaf. And my parents were seeking a program near my hometown, and my hometown simply didn't have one. By the way, the name sign that I use for Ironwood, I signed it this way because of its connection to mining in the town. And so Ironwood is signed it that way in my recitations. So my parents went seeking about, looking, and to make a long story short, I'll say that my mom found a deaf program that was speech-oriented deaf program in Houghton. Now, Houghton is, if you're familiar with the UP, where Ironwood is here, then Houghton is just up there on the peninsula. And so that comes up in one of my poems today, is why I mentioned it. And so there was a deaf program there, and it was oral oriented. And if you may not be familiar with this, oralism is this notion of educating deaf people. It's been very sort of binary in the past. There's been a speech only approach that forbade sign language that was somewhat prominent a long time ago, that used the auxiliary aids and hearing aids and forbade sign. And then there was signing education back in the day, which was largely held in schools for the deaf, and there was one downstate a little bit that had a school for the deaf that was more signing oriented. So at any rate, there's a lot of political division between hearing people who have dominated deaf education and have been the powerhouses who have administered more of these programs and have been, you know, steering parents in the direction of those oral programs. Now, bear in mind that 90% of deaf kids have hearing parents. Well, wait, let me get this right. It's about 90% of deaf kids have hearing parents. So 90% of the people who have deaf kids, of course, they want their kids to be like them, and they don't want to put in the effort to learn sign language so that their child goes up with full access. It's much easier to educate their child in a speech-only orientation. So some 9 years passed, and I went to Houghton and learned speech therapy and so forth. And the deaf program was a pretty small program and speech oriented, as I said. So let's see, there was one more bit of background I was going to give you before we began, but at any rate, I come from a very large hearing family. And obviously my family wasn't accessible to me. You know, there's many deaf people who come from hearing families shared this horrible experience that we in the deaf community called the dinner table syndrome. And let me give you a sense of what that means. Just a perfect example of the dinner table syndrome is me with my table of 9 siblings and the rest of the family. And of course, everybody's hearing except me, and they're chattering away and laughing and having a grand time. And isn't that so funny? And going back and forth. And as a deaf person, I'm looking back and forth, and I can't lip read at that pace. And so, you know, as a lip reader, we depend highly on context. So I mean by that, that if I don't know what we're talking about, there's no way I can lip read that. I mean, I often use this example. If I go to an art gallery and there's an art show there, and I'm standing there talking with a hearing friend, you know, of course, my brain thinks, okay, the context has to be that we're talking about Picasso or Van Gogh, whatever the case might be, right? So that's where my brain is oriented, and that's the context I'm giving what we're talking to, the world of art. But if someone comes up to me and says, so it starts talking about Argentina, then that, you know, you as hearing people in that audience may get the context of that automatically, but I don't get it. You know, it adds nothing to the context of art. I don't get why we're talking about Argentina. And okay, wait, I know Argentina is a country in South America. I follow that, but in that moment, my brain is oriented towards art and interpreting what's happening around me. So you have that. So take this and apply that to the situation of family chatter at the dinner table. And people change topics with such rapid pace. So by the time you move from one speaker to another to try to track the conversation, it's a loss. And so to add, you know, insult to injury, when somebody else says something and you ask what was said, they say, "I'll tell you later." That is so offensive to me as a person. That means that their pleasure and having a good time trumps my access in that moment. And so I learned as a deaf kid that I was a second and third class citizen wherever I was never on level ground, right? So you need to have access to this good time, but no, you're never going to have it. And so I think this is the experience of so many deaf people who really do not look forward to gathering with their hearing family because they're kept at a level of access that's inferior to everybody else around them. You know, you don't have access to the family lore and stories, and you don't know what's going on. So I think that's some of this context here. Through the years, my mother told me that I'd had a twin, or this possibility of having had a twin. I always wondered if I'd had a twin, how much better my life might have been. You know, so that musing and thought led me to thinking how different life would be. I would have had an ally by my side. I wouldn't have been alone in this family that was at a loss for what to do with me. So that's the context. Okay, so with that, I'm going to just dive into some of the poems, okay? My corpse self. Alone in these woods, across the street from Mom's house, trails worn down became boundaries of a country with no name. It would take me many years to walk this meandering path across peat, concrete, grill, escalator, airplane, elevator, aisle. In between, waited for clarifications. The only thing found in morass of trees and grasses was my shadow, barely alive, panting for my kiss, sleeping forlorn prince. He looked familiar, but nothing like a reflection. My own watery self, not even close, tall and lanky with a mask made of wood, stained and polished with veneer perfected from years pretending to be happy, while people took him down behind his back, threw tiny paper balls at him, always feigning innocence. Surely you jest, their faces all said. I looked down at his lax skeleton in a faux shroud of Turin. His body spotted with grays like leopard gone starved. I didn't want to hold him. I didn't want the weight of his troubles. When in my shoes, a sea, pebbles, a relentless reminder puncturing each step walked for miles. Couldn't shadow be light, easily blown away? Like how people dismiss me with a glance. Just like my hearing family and classmates constantly cleaved, mortar stabbed into bricks until my face turned unreadable. Now his there in my arms. The darkness of him, transparent, bright, shining eyes, begging me to save him, alone in these woods. Okay. So until I was 16, I wore not the kind of hearing aids you might be more familiar with, but the kind that were body mounted and had long, thick wires, and it was different technology. So you need to understand that for the context. So the next one is called Rich Boy 79, 1979. Deaf Rich Boy, 1979. I would one day be the son of that rich man with a monocle, found in the game of Monopoly. I'd own the entire town beyond Pamita. I wouldn't think twice about buying an expensive pair of designer jeans at the Down Under shop. At Stern and Field, on Aurora and Suffolk, all the kids in my class would ask meekly to see my latest handheld electronic game, the kind that you couldn't find anywhere, the kind kids would know everything about, the kind they'd grow antenna just to ferret them out. They'd turn into insects with shiny shellbacks, gleaming with bands of gold strapped across as they murmured and compared between themselves. Their dull scores blinking. Tiny sticks of red light, they'd huddle together and forget about everything. I'd wear the latest Nike sneakers, from J.C. Penney's. The kind none of the kids could afford. They'd stare and gawk at me, of all people, when they thought me poor. What with 8 siblings and a dog, packed into a house of only 4 bedrooms. My family weren't rich. Everybody knew that. But on that first day of school, I'd say nothing as I hung my denim trucker jacket on my hook. In the hallway, they'd see the name Furstenberg stitched on the back pocket of my new jeans. I'd be wearing a Blondie shirt to show off the fact that I went to Minneapolis to see the sultry Debbie Harry sing Heart of Glass. For once, the hearing aid cords winding up to my ears would look cool, as if I were always listening to something cool that they'd never hear. Always straining to hear the next hot band. I'd hear with them before they appeared on American Bandstand some Saturday afternoon. They'd wish to be deaf like me, always listening to the future. Those kids in class would whisper about me, never mocking me, but always with awe. Okay, so the next piece. I had a best friend in Houghton named Todd Colburn. And so I signed his name this way, TC. So that's the context. This is titled Charles E. Klingbeil. 1. Even back in 3rd grade, Chuck was taller and bigger than anyone in our class. I was becoming more and more mainstreamed in my hearing class. I was to sit in the front row and lip read Miss Roadhaven. Todd probably sat near me. We had our art classes in the basement of Ryan's school. It wasn't designed to be a classroom, probably a former storage room. It had a quadrant of 4 tables. Chuck and his buddies took one table. Todd and I, with a few others, took another. During a lull, when the teacher had to step out for a minute, Chuck nudged his friends. He made a dirty face at me. I didn't say anything. It was the first time a hearing classmate had made fun of me. Todd suddenly said something. I'd never seen him so angry. I was afraid to ask what he just said. Chuck and his buddies just cracked up. The coals of fury in Todd's eyes never cooled, even when the teacher returned. 2. Returning to Houghton as a sophomore, I unexpectedly recognized Chuck in the hallway between classes. Impossibly taller and bigger with broad shoulders, I'd never seen a boy my age strut or bulk up that big. My Ironwood Catholic high school didn't have a football team. Chuck was my first boy man. Not a boy, not a teenager, not yet a man, but an aura of what he would become. He didn't seem to recognize me. He was apparently big on football. In our classroom, he never registered on my radar. I wasn't afraid of him at all. These jocks were never my friends. 3. The rules of football have always been beyond my comprehension. So, on a big green field of white stripes, a whistle startles, and then a football is tossed some yards, and then bam, a mass of arms and legs and helmets. And all for what? More brain concussions? Now that Chuck has died suddenly, a heart attack at O'Hare Airport, I Google for images of him, but my jaw drops. He was an NFL player. Really? Wow. He had played for the Miami Dolphins. Anyway, he had a knee injury or something, got addicted to heavy painkillers, and had been using anabolic steroids too. Ended up coaching in Michigan Tech. Made a few drug-addled miscalculations, stood up and responded to the judge. Well, my thinking got me here. Hey, Chuck, I forgive you. Too late to say that now, but yeah. So a little bit of explanation here. You may recall that I was in Houghton for 9 years, and really the first 6 years was Houghton, and then there was 5 years in Ironwood, and then there were 3 years again in Houghton. And so for 6 years it was in Houghton, and let's see, 76, it was 10, and then came back to Ironwood full time. And for there was a 5-year gap there away from Houghton. So this is again about Todd. Entitled, That One Jet Hockey Game. Todd, you unexpectedly reappeared at my house in Ironwood one December evening, a year after I was transferred back home to Ironwood Catholic grade school. 2 hours drive away from you. Teachers and parents had felt I would be a real mainstream success, and closer to my family too. No one seemed to care how much work it took me to lip read, even with my hearing aids. But anyway, there you stood. You were a bit taller, but so was I. In those days, nobody was sending off warning bells about the onset of puberty. You wore a button shirt. You met some of my siblings who were watching TV, and my mom too. Maybe you met my dad too. Your divorced dad had relocated back to Ironwood, so you were visiting him. He didn't live too far from my house, just over the hill actually, though I didn't know it at the time. So there you were with your impish smile when we went downstairs to play jet hockey. I wanted to tell you about them boys at my new school who had figured out ways to make me cry so they could laugh at my nasal voice missing consonants, and my ear molds standing out like buttons waiting to be pressed only in my nightmares. I wanted to tell you how badly I missed you. Each time I stood by the brick wall, watching them boys play Nerf football. I wanted to tell you how much I wanted to run away from home and hide in your bedroom off Royce Road, so no one but you would find me. I would be your ghost friend, alive but never dead, always looking out for you. Instead, we stood facing each other on either side of the big jet hockey console, its blue and red markings printed in the formica of an ice hockey rink. With punctured with holes to let air rise, allowing the flapjack puck to float across the sheen surface as if a UFO zigzagging. We played the game so hard with our round hand sticks that sometimes the puck flew straight up and slapped the low ceiling above us. We laughed so hard. It was as if nothing between us had changed, and yet everything had. Oh, Todd, I lied about everything because I didn't want you to worry. And I'm now open for questions, Q&A, discussion. I'm open. Thank you.
Well, I'll just start by saying thank you. I feel a little bad that you couldn't see all of our faces, but I know you were talking to Adam, because if everyone else was like us three, we were smiling.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
It was a wonderful poetry reading, and
Really, just one moment.
my own, it was nice, but you reading them so much better.
I would like to say something.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that if, as a deaf person, once everybody's video came up, it became hard, the tiles are shifting. So if just the one person who's speaking at a time can have their video up, that way I can see the interpreter signing. And, you know, I'm also not an actor. I can't memorize lines. And so I also, I've got to tell you, I cheat. I've got a teleprompter that helps me out. And I practice my rendition. That's part of how I do it. But some of this is also different because on a stage, you know, and I love to have actual deaf people in the audience because it ups my game with performance. Hearing people don't know how well I'm signing. I could be signing lazily going all through it, and the hearing audience doesn't know any difference, right? I still like to have put the same level of effort I would have with the deaf person in the audience because, you know, I know we're competing with like all kinds of streaming services and social media for attention. You've given the time out. That's why I try to put in what I can to make sure that this is polished and ready performance. And, you know, I think people think that ASL and English are the same thing and that it's that easy, but the ASL is not English on the hands. It follows a very different word order, sentence structure. And so they each have their own syntax. And so many of you may not be familiar with that. And one of the reasons I enjoy working with Adam as my interpreter for these kinds of things is because we have a system that we've worked out, right? So he's reading it in English, but I've also written for Adam the ASL gloss. And by this, I mean, it's a way of tracking which signs were done in which order. You can't, I can't look at the English and then try to sign in ASL. Because if I did that, I would be doing this constant translation effort. So instead, I give the English version to Adam, the interpreter, and I read the ASL gloss. It's written in ASL order, and it's a way of prompting me. And I hope the interpreter was able to keep up with me. That's where that kind of practice is so important. I give the materials to the interpreter ahead of time. and make sure I sound good, right? So, you don't want the voice quality to not be on par. So hopefully there wasn't too much lag between the sign and the voicing. And so, yeah. So if anybody has a question, come on up.
I have a comment if I can. Hi there, Raymond. I just wanted to say, when you talked about the dinner table as a deaf child, that really hit my heart. As a teacher of oral deaf for children, I just want you to know every principal I worked under, I fought for signing for certain children in my classroom. I had a very bad experience with one sweet young boy who was profoundly deaf, and the principal would not let me do any signing with him. And his parents just wanted him to be oral so badly. It ended up that the mother committed suicide because she couldn't handle it anymore. So that dear student not only was frustrated with not being able to communicate, but then he lost his mother and could not be communicated to what had gone on. So I am totally for signing and for oral, the combined program for those who can and for those who can't, signing, because signing is going to be needed all through your life. So I'm right behind you. I thank you so much for these poems. Knowing you from when you're little and seeing you now as a man makes me care for you and love you all the more. Thank you so much, Raymond.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. And for those of you that don't know who Mary here is, my former teacher when I was 9, 10,
Yeah,
11, somewhere in there, in that range.
8, 9, yeah. Cutest little redhead with freckles.
So delighted you could join here. And back then there was no signing allowed, oral only program, but I mean, nice to have you around, and that know that some people had some comments to add. So thank you.
Yeah, I'll let you. Thanks.
Okay. All right. Other questions, comments? I'm open. Did you have any questions, Rachel? Go ahead. Oh, just one moment. Let me get where I can see you.
Hold on.
Okay, ready. Ready. So I'm curious about how much time it takes for you to craft that book. Yeah, the Compassion, Michigan. How long did that take? And I'm curious, like, for any of your books, how long does a work like that take to do? Okay, thank you, Rachel. So it really depends. Every book is different. Sometimes I've got an idea and it's on fire and it's just this rapid process of creation. And then sometimes I've got a book that slogs a little bit in the production. It just goes in stages and spurts, and sometimes I even have to put a pause on it. Compassion, Michigan was one that was inspired by a couple of things. One, a book called Winesburg, Ohio. Winesburg. Yeah, I think I got that. Ohio, yeah. And it was written by Sherwood and Anderson and published, and the interpreter missed the date. Beautiful, full of short stories and amazing poetry that was very descriptive of that time. And when Ohio was considered the Midwest, And so I love that book so much. I read it a lot and it had a big influence on me. And then I think in 2016, 2015, about that, I met Eleanor from Michigan, and one of the publishing companies there, not Victor, somebody else there, and who was talking about their interest in the work that centered around the UP. And so I thought, why not tell stories about my hometown of Ironwood? And Winesboro, Ohio was, that covered a span of a few years, Compassion, Michigan, I wanted to cover about 130 years of Ironwood history because I'm fascinated with the history of my hometown. There's a lot there that most people just don't know. So, I mean, the fact that there was interest in the work really inspired me to be very productive. I think it was a total of about 3 months. I was just on fire with it. And then I was hoping that the book would be published in 2019 at the 100-year mark, but it wasn't. And I think they ended up turning my book down. And I was kind of, but I'm grateful to my eventual publisher of the book. I'm very grateful. So then Once Upon a Twin was a different process. I think there was about 2 years had passed and I hadn't really published a book of poetry. I needed some inspiration. I just was sitting in the muck, and then I decided to go to St. Louis. I had some friends there and I stayed for a month. Give myself kind of, an author's retreat, if you will. And I had no idea that, when I got to St. Louis, exactly what I was going to do. It was this artist in residence. I was going to do something, and then when I got there, well, I should mention that each book of poetry, I make sure that it's not the same. I don't want to be reproducing the same thing. Each has to have its own character, Madonna, for example, every album has a very different sort of look and feel and sound, and she wants every album to have a unique look and feel and its own character. So the same way. So with this book, I decided, well, first I was thinking through this and I was thinking, I remembered the stories my mother had told me about how I could have been a twin. And strangely enough, I'd never explored that. And I thought, why not write about it? Even though I hadn't really explored it. So that started things off. And then as I got into the book, I realized I couldn't write this in regular English, which you might think of it, standard English, because if you were reading this book, you'll notice there's no use of capital letters, no use of punctuation. And that's intentional in that book because I was trying to give that language of incompleteness, that lack of full development, of wholeness there, that lack of. And so I thought it was right for that book. I don't like books that sort of are full of sloppy writing, they just amble around, or they're just doing lowercase only on the I's for effect. Oh, hold on one second. Okay, so that very sort of pretentiousness, I don't care for it, but I thought that structure worked for this book and its intent. Does that help answer your question? It does. It does. Thank you. Okay, any other questions?
I'd just like to make a brief comment. I moved to tears by you guys. I can hardly talk. I feel like I've gone on a journey to a new land that I've always been in, but I couldn't see it because it was invisible to me. I hope that doesn't sound pretentious, but thank you, both of you guys. It's been an amazing evening for me.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question there?
I just had one. I'm glad you put in here this double helix poem because it really kind of helps people who don't do the ALS to understand what you are doing. I'm glad it's here.
Thank you so much. And strangely enough, that poem was written originally in English, right? Some time ago. And then it was the end of that month there in St. Louis. One morning, it just came to me in a flash. Why not look at this and show a visible representation of the helix? Because twins is all about DNA, right? It's about having the same copy of DNA or very nearly the same exact DNA. And so I thought in ASL, I can use ASL gloss to express this poem in 2 different languages in the same way. Now, there's not, ASL, I talked about how different they are, but there's still a connection. Like we're still family, and my family didn't give me that ASL that I needed, but still the book is kind of about that desire for connection with my hearing family. And my hope that if I had had a twin, that would have been my staunch supporter, that I wouldn't have been alone or isolated, given that, in that hearing family of 9. I think that is this dream I have about that twin. So that's why I dedicated this book to my friend Todd, because looking back, really, he could have been my twin. He could have been that staunch companion, even though he was this hearing boy. And I don't know why we had such fast friendship between us. I think probably because back then, he was this heavyset boy who, you see, lots of kids are heavyset, these days, but it just wasn't as common back then. But back in those days, it was much less common. And in the 3rd grade, I think, to have a heavyset kid was not seen the same way. And I think he was maybe subject to, some feelings about that. But he ended up growing up, tall and lanky, a Navy fellow and all of that. But back then he was a little different. So maybe that's part of what created affinity between us, because, people didn't want me, people didn't want him because of our differences, maybe. Any other questions?
Julie
Was it
here.
Rachel or Julie?
Julianne, I'm your interest in not interest, your poems about Catholicism and your being an altar boy and having 10 different pairs of shoes that you could wear so that you would all look the same on the altar as an altar boy. And the fact that the priest, this father, was a pedophile. I was fascinated by all of the emphasis or references, I shouldn't say, references to Catholicism and your involvement as an altar boy. Do you want to comment on how Catholicism shaped you as a young boy? In this particular poem about the Baltimore Catechism for the Deaf. Anyway, I was fascinated by all of that. So would you like to talk about the...
Sure, I'm happy to.
Okay.
And funny enough, so my first book was called St. Michael's Fall. That book was really exploring a couple of things. One, oralism and Catholicism, right? And so how I found my own identity and community in Ironwood. And then after that, I kind of stopped, thinking about, that Catholic experience is really, for a long time, I called myself a recovering Catholic, if you will. That's been my longstanding joke for many years. I just thought, that's it. And then it came time to write what became Once Upon a Twin. And that's when I realized I couldn't, it wasn't right to deny the Catholic in me. And that's why I felt like it had to be included. Because, that twin being gone, I don't know, for some reason, I had this sense that it belonged there. And then, oh no, about that priest, interesting enough, I didn't know until I guess 7 years ago. I didn't know until then about that priest. And then he died in 2005. But it so happened that, I don't know exactly how, but I remember looking him up on the internet and finding out that he had sexual allegations and just being dumbfounded. It was just so random. Just, hey, I wonder what happened with this person and then it seemed a little shaky in my memory, but then, oh my gosh, he sure enough was. And it was in the LA Times, I think. And he was among 26 priests who they found they had sufficient evidence on, and he was in the LA diocese, and he went off to a town named Bergland. Went up to a town called Bergland in the Upper Peninsula, and so the Catholic Church just did the textbook response of, what do we do with a priest? Well, we ship him somewhere else, in some small town where nobody knows about him and nobody knows his history. Now, I didn't have any experience with him, and I heard about others though, but oh. And then I think somebody else, was it Shelley or Rachel? Rachel, and then Shelley? Let's see, okay, Rachel. I don't know how many people here will know what autism means. AUDISM, autism. And Raymond, you might be able to explain a little more about it, but I'm curious as a writer, and I as a writer have this experience, so I'm curious about your experience confronting autism in your work, either in terms of trying to be published, and getting your work published, or in dealing with hearing editors. Do you have any experience like that you can share? Right, sure. I'll give you one example in a nutshell. So as a deaf writer, let me just back this up a second. Some of you may not know the term inspiration porn, but inspiration porn refers to the idea that, when somebody has a disability, it's typically about somebody that is disabled, able-bodied people use that to feel so good about themselves. Like, so for example, oh my goodness, look at this disabled person, like FDR, right? Yeah, and there's some play that where at the end of the play, they're talking about polio, and at the very end of the play, all of a sudden FDR stands just briefly to give this stirring moment, to give this idea that, oh, he's so close to able-bodied and everybody feels good about it. But you know what I mean? It's not realistic. Or another example is where, like The Miracle Worker with Helen Keller, for example, is another great example of inspiration porn. And there are a couple of things that it means the writer has created the story and omitted key facts. Like there's a couple of key facts missing from this story, because before Helen, before her teacher came to her home, do you know that she had already created about 60 home signs that she was using commonly in her home? She was already signing. Not ASL, mind you, they were home signs, but she had a vocabulary of some 60 words before the teacher ever got there. And she communicated with her best friend, the daughter of the cook, who was Black. Then when Anne Sullivan gets here, she decided, oh no, that little girl that you've been playing with is no good. You can't play with her anymore. So if you look at Helen Keller's own book, her own autobiography, I think it's called My Story, something like that. I think somewhere in the first 12 pages, she talks about that she had 60 signs at home, and that for the rest of her life, she wondered where that little girl had gone. She never got in touch with her again. So that means, for the sake of that play, they make Helen Keller look like a savage who knew no language, and they make her almost apish. And then by the end of the play, she's learned to fingerspell in somebody's hand. I mean, it's an insult to Helen Keller and to the legacy of deafblind people, portraying them so animalistically. It's insulting. And so that's kind of inspiration porn that you run into. Now, I'll also say that some 30 years ago, I wrote an essay called Note Takers for Deaf Gay Writers, or Notes for Deaf Gay Writers, okay? And there were 2 months later, I was living in New York, and I went to a big literary party where they had, writers, publishers, so forth, all of that. And a lot of people knew of that magazine. Well, there was this one editor for another magazine who said, hey, you want to write an article about, deaf writers? So I wrote this article, and in that article, I mentioned that so it's not so much about who the person is what's written. And the editor ended up turning it down because he was like, no, I wanted to see a story of your suffering. I wanted to see the trauma and heartache of being a deaf writer. And that's not what I'd written. I'd written something that talked literally just about being a deaf writer. And they wanted this saga of suffering. And so I think as a writer, as a deaf writer, I have to bring my work and bring it to hearing editors who don't know anything about deaf culture, deaf experience. And they're often looking for inspiration porn, which my work just doesn't center around that because I don't think it's the right thing to do. Deaf people, there's no reason to be using us to be inspiring other people for these weird reasons. There's just, that's not the point. So Rachel? Well, just kind of a brief comment. It's kind of similar to the experience I've had with hearing editors. They'll always throw the word tragic or some kind of tragedy into my writing. When it's talking about becoming deaf or, when I'm talking about my deaf experience, they'll try to edit in these ideas of tragedy into it. And I'm like, no, no, no. Then I got to go back and clean these references that they put in there out because there's nothing tragic about this story. Simply am deaf. I think so many times I've had that experience. And I think people don't realize that in our American culture. Autism is so ingrained that it's not, and ableism is so ingrained that people don't even recognize how it's there. People that are deaf or disabled are automatically not seen as being on par to the superior able-bodied people, and so they don't realize how they're playing that out in their language choice and all of those things. And I think Shelley had something, she's gone, but I remember popping up at one point. And anybody else?
I just wanted to comment that being disabled doesn't mean incapable. You're just as capable as anyone else.
That's right. That's right. Okay, Brandy.
Well, I had two comments, more than questions. The first one, being an editor myself as well, I have pointed a lot of people for the Consciousness Style Guide, which I found to be a great resource to send people to learn about, being conscious of how you write and how you edit groups that you are not necessarily a part of. And I recommend that to all editors and recommend it to your editors too. It's a great resource for writers, and especially writing about people whose communities you aren't necessarily a part of. And it's online and they send a monthly email and it's awesome. And then the other thing is I just wanted to comment that I have read your book, your poetry and some stories for the UP Reader as the audio book. And I really enjoy watching you sign, and I love reading poetry because I love the rhythm of it. And I love how the rhythm continues on through your hands as well, that it's the same, you get the same feel. It's different, but the same at the same time. And I love watching the rhythm of the hands as well as hearing it. And especially since I do more of the speaking part. It's beautiful in both ways.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. I'll also add that when you're writing about a community that you're not a member of, I so recommend asking for a sensitivity reader, they call it. I think it's so important to have a reader that has that purpose. I'm not going to name the writer, but there's a very well-esteemed writer with a well-esteemed, publisher instead of experiment that wrote about deaf people who just had atrocious errors in there because the editor was hearing, the writer wasn't in group, was not familiar with deaf culture, and not familiar with what they were saying in their writing, and it was aghast. I just cringe factor, totally. And kind of the same idea of having a white writer talking about Black communities when they don't ask for a Black reader to read this and say, hey, does this not gel right? Is this inaccurate? Does this really line up? You got to also be willing to take that critique when you get it too. When I've worked with Black actors who are performing my plays, they have the full stamp of approval on their portrayal. If it's a Black poem that they're portraying, then they tell me, like, you're in charge of that. Me as a white guy coming here, I'm coming at it with a different set of privileges. I think they have the last say about how that's interpreted in their community, or for their community. So I think that's important. Yeah. And just for example, I remember the story of, when was it? Maybe some 30 years ago. I went to Ironwood to give a reading, and fascinating, but the first time I think it was like 96. And I showed up at the theater, and there were like 9 deaf people in the audience in the first row. Like, whoa, wait, where'd these people come from, right? And then, all right, that's great. I was thrilled to be signing, because so often as a deaf person, I want to put this deaf audience first. And the fact, no offense, but like, I'm signing it for them. So the town of Ironwood has a community college. And there's one woman who came up to me who was signing, and she was using what's called signing exact English. So there's ASL, which is an actual language. It's a full language with a full set of the grammatical rules, sentence structure, so forth, all of that, right? Just like English has a complete language in its own right. Signing exact English is a system of signing, and it's very odd and frankly ugly on the eyes. It's a system, not a language. It takes discrete vocabulary signs from ASL, but it's used only to teach English for deaf kids. So it's not pretty. It's very clumsy way of signing. I'm trying to think of an example. So in ASL, for example, and the English word, it's time to go outside, okay? In ASL, time to go, right? This way. In C though, it's time to go out on my side. It really is a clunky way of talking. It's not a language. It's a system of signs, but not a real language. So this background is important to understand what happened. This hearing lady comes up to me, and she's signing to me in this strange way. And they teach sign in that community college, and she was overjoyed to be doing this. And then I can't tell you though, I was just trying not to lose my temper. And it's not that I'm not one who's prone to doing that. I was just like, this is the worst. She was so proud that she was producing children of lesser God. And she was using a deaf woman that lived about an hour from Ironwood. That deaf woman was an adept ASL signer, but this teacher and director you see, and she was forcing the deaf actor to sign in this completely artificial way because she, as a director, didn't know the real language. And so I went to see that production. It was painful on my eyes. I can't tell you. It hurt so bad. It did not do justice. It's the visual equivalent of nails on a chalkboard. How bad that was on my eyes. So that's what I mean. And it happens again and again. And normally, I don't say anything bad about hearing people, but at that presentation with those 9 deaf people that were there in that audience, I told everybody in the audience, you know, that this model that you've just seen tonight of signing C is not a real language. And so I'm using the actual language ASL. So I'm going to encourage everybody to learn ASL to talk with real people, like use these people who are actual users of the language as your language models. Now that lady never talked to me again, and I've never regretted it. You know, for me, his premise is that deaf people have access to their language and culture. And so I think a lot of them that were there were used to saying C, and then when they saw actual ASL, it was like, oh, like butter over here. It was so easy on the eyes. I think, like, you know, C can be kind of like C signs exact English, kind of like your clunky first bicycle with training wheels. And then you get on your roadster with it where you're adept and you're just flying by. That's the real language. Okay, Rachel. Can't see. The interpreter can't see her. So it was awful. I've seen the way people sign and sign exact English and the impact that has on students and on children. It can be a really profoundly negative impact on them. I have a short story, an example of this, about this deaf boy who was 17, tall, deaf boy. To see him, you'd think he looked like the toughest fellow, right? I remember him coming up to me one day, and I was his former teacher. And at that school,
I think we lost Adam. I think so. Did we lose Adam?
Yeah, I think his screen froze up and then he disappeared.
I'm not sure what happened. Hello. My speech is not perfect, which is why I prefer to have an appointment. The relation to my holding. I think there probably be an internet problem on Adam Aaron because his screen looks frozen. Otherwise, Rachel, I could boom. Rachel, maybe I could point for you more. Or, but I think you may have to start again because I don't know where his video was frozen.
Okay.
Maybe I'll just turn on my voice.
So I'll just tell you all a short story to illustrate what C sign is, the impact it has. A long time ago, I was teaching and my student grew up and he became 17. It was in a hearing school that used C signs. And that student came up to me and his face was very concerned, very worried. So I asked him what was wrong. And he said, Rachel, I think Christmas is broken. It's broken. And he was really upset. I said, what do you mean? Why do you think Christmas is broken? And he said, well, Colleen told me that on December 23rd, Christmas would break. Colleen was an aide at the school.
Break.
And I realized that she had used the sign break. For Christmas vacation, Christmas break, she used the sign break, something breaking instead. And he thought, oh, Christmas is breaking, it's going to break. This is a 17-year-old. So I had to tell him, no, she used the wrong sign. That's C sign. She didn't mean Christmas is breaking. Don't worry. And oh, he was so relieved. It was funny, but wow, poor kids.
Yeah, what to add to what Rachel done. Besides that English thing, you use the same style for anyone.
Right.
I mean, besides You use the same type of the same word.
Yeah.
So you say break, but in English we have different type of the word break. It depends on the meaning. For example, vacation, break, intermission,
Right.
to clear.
Yeah.
Because I think the word that they have maybe 20 different signs for the word that.
Yeah.
It depends on the meaning of the word behind the word. Now, that's the problem with
Right.
Chinese and English, among other problems, is that you're not learning contact.
Right.
Anyway, Adam, are you back?
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened with your connection, but we're back. Anybody else with anything else?
And I just want to say thank you so much. I think, to me, a good writer, puts you in their shoes. And I think, reading your poetry did that, and then meeting you did that. I'm in love with Todd. It was really great. And like I say, I want to read more, and I feel a lot like Victor did. Like, it was beautiful. I think you and Adam work very well together. And I want to thank you both. And I think that's...
So I just want to thank all of you so very much. And if I could mention one quick last thing I forgot. This year I have 3 books published this year. And so I'm going to show you the titles. That's it.
Great.
Luna Fly, right here, which was just published. And then, of course, Chlorophyll. And then the next book to be published, the newest, is this.
Oh.
A Quiet Foghorn. More notes from a deaf gay life. And that's it. And of course, this Compassion, Michigan, which is Ironwood Stories. And if you have any more questions, I guess not, but everybody, thank you so much for bearing with us with the tech issues. I appreciate it, everyone.
Okay. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all hopefully next month. So thank you.
You've been watching the UP Notable Books Club, brought to you by the Upper Peninsula Publisher and Authors Association. To join or for more information, please visit us at www.upa.org or www.upnotable.com.